So, the idea, the liberal, you speak truth to power.
Yeah.
But the real thing is that truth and power are not opposite relationships. Only power can speak to power. The Muslims are too large in number to be completely ignored.
Around 2 billion now.
Yeah, right? But they're too weak to be accommodated.
هذه الدولة الوطنية قد فشلت في إنجاز وعودها.
So the idea of Europe or the West incarnating universalism has been so ripped to shreds that it requires great acts of amnesia for anyone, even in the West, to believe it anymore.
يعني لو قاله أسامة مثلا في بلد عربي فإنه على الأرجح لن يقابلك مرة أخرى.
That anti-Semitism to some extent has been replaced by Islamophobia and a kind of pro-Zionist position. The first sentence of the book proper begins with Bismillah. And the idea is that the last sentence of the book will end with Inshallah.
بروفيسور سلمان سيد، أستاذ النظرية النقدية وفكر تفكيك الاستعمار في جامعة ليدز، ومؤسس ومحرر مجلة الذي أورينت. مرحبا بك في فاصلة منقوطة. Welcome to فاصلة منقوطة.
Thank you for having me.
أريد أن أبدأ بمديح مستحق وليس فيه أي قدر من المجاملة لكتابك استعادة الخلافة، فأنا أعتقد أنه واحدة من أهم المساهمات النظرية في الفكر السياسي الإسلامي في العقود الأخيرة. نحن الآن في اسطنبول، آخر عواصم الخلافة العثمانية، وبينما نتحدث الآن نقترب كثيرا من الذكرى 100 لسقوط الخلافة العثمانية أو ذكرى إسقاطها. في يوليو 1924 انتهت الخلافة رمزيا واسميا بعد أن انتهت فعليا قبل ذلك بسنوات. برأيك ما الذي يعنيه سقوط الخلافة بالنسبة للمسلمين؟ هل هي مجرد خسارة رمزية لهم أم هي تمثل شيئا أكبر من ذلك؟
No, firstly, thank you very much for your comments on recording the Caliphate. I think the 100 years should help us reflect on the consequences of the Caliphate, not so much as a historical entity, but more as a sort of political theoretical or philosophical category. And in many ways, you could argue that the abolition, transfer, the ending of the Caliphate is the beginning of a type of political thinking in the Muslim Ummah. Because up to the time of the Caliphate, you had concentration on the idea of what would be a good ruler and what are the qualities that need to be a good ruler, etc. And all the major schools of thought agreed with the institution, but they had differences on how to ensure the quality of the person occupying the office. And you could have bad ones and good ones, but the institution was there. With the abolition, you start asking a question of what is the relationship between Muslims and a state. Is there a requirement for that? And in a sense, what we've had is 100 years of trying to work out that question, answers to that question, in the context of major assaults on the expressions of Muslimness. You've seen that, for example, through the 1917 in the communist revolutions. You saw that before with colonialism. So and then you've seen it through the post-colonial, what I would call the sort of Kemalist tendency to try and regulate and subjugate and marginalize expressions of Muslimness. So all of these things are in the context where Muslims are being forced to think about their relationship with the political order and being Muslim, and whether that implies or doesn't imply. And I think that, and the 100 years should give us perhaps an opportunity to reflect upon that, reflect not on the history of the Caliphate, which is, I have no problem with people talking about the various histories and getting a deeper understanding of the historical development of the institution, because we're still dominated by historiography, which simply talks about these things in a way of simply thinking about decline constantly. You have the for righteous caliphate, and everything of that is just various shades of decline. One would like to see a more complex history and looking at the various challenges, again, because but more importantly, in what the caliphate says about the Muslim condition now and what its absence makes possible or impossible. So I would like to see that as the opportunity offered by this 100 years to see where we are, where we want to be, and what are the impediments for those, for us to getting from where we are to where we want to be.
الفراغ الذي تركته الخلافة ما يزال غير ممتلئ بما يكفي بعد. ظهرت الدولة القومية ما بعد الاستعمارية وما بعد الكولونيالية، ولتملأ هذا الفراغ جغرافيا. ولكن ربما نستطيع الآن أن نقول بعد 70 سنة أو 800 أو 80 سنة بأن هذه الدولة الوطنية قد فشلت في إنجاز وعودها، سواء بالرفاه والرخاء والازدهار والعدالة، بل وحتى أخيرا في الاستقرار، وهي تعاني من أزمة عميقة على مستوى الشرعية. قد يسأل سائل: ما هو المختلف فيما يتعلق بدول العالم الإسلامي والحاضرة الإسلامية؟ لماذا تجاوزت الشعوب مرحلة الإمبراطوريات الكبرى وتحولت إلى دول وطنية وقومية بينما لم ينجز المسلمون هذا التحول؟
I think firstly I would say to you it's very important that we don't remain uncritical of the historiography of the nation state. So one of the arguments presented is that in the early part or the late part of the 18th century, early part of the 19th century, Europe had a series of revolutions which founded the nation state. And since then, the invention of the nation state has become globalized. But in fact, Europe was a nation state in Europe, but an empire outside Europe, basically, right? So countries like France, Britain, Netherlands, they were nation states in some aspect, but they were also nation state empires.
Yeah.
In which case, the majority of the people that these countries ruled were often people who had no political rights. And so there was this notion of the historiography of what the nation state is, and the nation state as being some kind of organic representation of where the true political identity of people's lies. That the idea is that their people exist, and when they're free, they will have their own nation state. But I would suggest to you what really happens is the reverse of the process, that the state builds nations.
All right.
And the process of state building and nation building is violent and challenging and perhaps not as necessary. So the reason this Europe embarked on the possibility of building the nation state wasn't because there was an organic people wanting to be free. It was through a series of contingent relationships between various authorities around, for example, the Christian church, which had a particular reality. The other thing is this, that what people forget is from the very beginning, the nation state takes hold at the same time where the idea of racial logics in Europe become more and more prominent.
Yeah.
And so the nation state is also a racial state. And you see this in small ways all over the example. But for example, soldiers of the Habsburgs from Spain fighting in Italy, which also belongs to Habsburg, around about the 16th century, they start distinguishing themselves as having superior qualities because of their blood.
All right.
So you have at the same time the idea of the nation becomes racialized. So what this means for populations which are far more heterogeneous is a major acts of violence to homogenize them. And that act of violence has basically been the history of the colonialism and the history of the post-colonial state.
All right.
And I think that is where the problem lies, that everywhere in the world, with the exception of the settler colonies where the violence was so great that they almost literally obliterated the pre-colonial polities, you have this kind of tremendous exercises of violence to try and create nations rather than trying to create communities of engagement, participation, and settlement.
It's top to down, not down to top.
It's top to down, but it's not even rather top to down. It's actually about trying to say, for example, here is the nation, and here's what a typical person of that nation looks like, what they eat, what they speak, how they comport themselves.
Yeah.
And it's a complete denial of the way that very old communities have existed. Perhaps the best way I can illustrate this is to look at one of the arguments that is often presented, and I'm slightly getting away from the point, but I think it's worth making this example.
Go ahead.
The established liberal democracies have this kind of discourse that they are tolerant communities produced by, demonstrated by their way that they are able to deal with differences, etc. Yeah. So this is a constant argument that's made. And it's often made in contrast to others, but let's say the Islamicate. Yeah? That they are tolerant, the Islamicate world isn't, and that's why it's violent. England became continuously Christian about the same time as Iraq became continuously Muslim. What is now Iraq, what is now England.
All right.
About 100 years between two of them.
You mean this was in the 8th or 9th?
8th or 9th century.
Yeah.
So basically, there was a period before, but that's where the continuously Christianization became. And so if you go to England, there are no pre-Christian communities in that entire country now. After 1,400 years of Christianity, there are no pre-Christian communities. I mean, of significance, right there. If you go to Iraq, even today, you will find pre-Islamic communities self-sustaining. And if you had arrived, let's say before Iraq became colonized in the 1920s or whatever, you had found those communities thriving in a way that they haven't been able to thrive. So if after 1,400 years of Christian rule, you have no communities, the only communities is, for example, the Jewish community. Most of it comes in the early 20th century. The Muslim and Hindu community, which are again 20th century post-colonial groupings. There is no other pre-Christian communities left. So how is it that if both societies are equally tolerant, in Iraq, you have the existence of many pre-Muslim communities in hundreds of thousands and none there. And what that does is show you that the heterogeneity working, let's say, in a country like Iraq and a country like England is very different. And what you've had is the state then regulating language, regulating grammar, regulating food, regulating national myths to create this idea of this imagined community, which is 1,000 years plus. And the task to do that in a country like Iraq or Turkey or Indonesia requires a degree of violence that up to the post-colonial period, Muslim rulers were reluctant to do, but also couldn't see the logic of doing it either.
أول الملاحظة أو تأكيدا على ما تقول، هنا اسطنبول قبل مرحلة الدولة الحديثة كان نسبة المسلمين فيها تقريبا 57%، وعلى مستوى الدولة لم تكن تزيد عن 80 أو 75%. عملية التجانس الديني وطبعا القومي والإثني لم تحصل إلا على يد مصطفى كمال أتاتورك.
The two elements to this, firstly, of course, the Balkan Wars and the expulsion of Muslims, up to 25% of the Muslim populations just expelled during the Balkan Wars of almost epidemic proportions. But then during the Kemalist attempt to reclassify all the population of Anatolia as being Turkish. And the idea that there are some who are mountain Turks who've forgotten how to speak proper Turkish, the idea of the standardization of language, all of those things were part of that kind of project of building a homogenous state through acts of violence, the violence that we remember. And I think that is the case in nearly every single major Muslim population.
وأنت تعتقد أن هذه الكمالية هي النموذج المثالي فلنقل لعملية التحديث في الأماكن الأخرى.
The significance of Ottoman was that it was the most powerful, most independent Muslim political structure. If you can do that there, then it becomes a model in places like Iran. Reza Khan follows what Mustafa Kemal is doing. And Afghanistan similarly attempt to do this. And the linking of modernization with westernization. So you think that to make Muslim countries modern, you have to westernize them. But westernization, for historical reasons, mean the expulsion of the Islamic hate. So you're involved in reducing Muslimness to be able to present yourself as being modern and Western. And that then is supposed to deliver modernity and prosperity.
إذن لعل هذا التهميش وهذه الإهانة هي ما يدفع المسلمين للحنين باستمرار إلى الخلافة، أو للتعبير عن نوع من الشعور بالانجذاب إلى هذه الفكرة رغم مرور كل هذه السنوات. يعني أننا لو أخذنا أمثلة أخرى، ربما في كوريا، ربما في اليابان، كان هناك أيضا تقاليد محلية، وأيضا حصلت عملية من التحديث والانفصال عن تلك التقاليد. لكن ما الذي يجعل هذه الحالة الإسلامية متعلقة بهذه الرمزية المفقودة؟
But I think if you look at Japan and you look at China, their attempt to westernize or modernize doesn't have the notion at that time, strictly speaking, of how westernization is identified with the exclusion of the Islamic. I mean, this is to do with the history of Muslim European relations, which go further back in time in a way. That is it possible can you be Muslim and be in Europe, or the boundaries of Europe always stop where there are Muslims? So, I mean, this is one of the issues there. I also think it's to do with the selectiveness. So, for example, the Ottomans, the Japanese and the Chinese have in the early 20th century, late 19th century, all of them have language reform movements of different kinds, right? But the question is what they're trying to do with the language reform is somehow to make it simplified, to sort of democratize it, open it up so that it's not only elite scholarship that can read there. But the language reform that's eventually implemented into the Turkish Republic is one which basically makes everyone illiterate.
It's a new language.
Yeah, it's a new language completely. It makes everyone illiterate.
The Turkish citizen now cannot read.
Yeah.
100 years ago,
yeah. And it makes everyone illiterate. And that illiteracy is different than actually democratizing and making it easier or whatever. So, I mean, even within that, there are choices that one could make. And I think some of the choices that are made are based on a certain internalization of Orientalism. And that's not necessary. That wasn't the only way you could progress. So I think I think there is a sense in which many, many Muslims recognize that the governments and the political orders that they have lack legitimacy, not in a grand way, but even in a day-to-day way, that they can't, like you said, secure prosperity, stability, justice, fairness. You may not be a heavily politicized figure, but you want to have some certainty, some decency of treatment, some belief that there is a notion of mercy and justice involved in governance. And they know that the ideals of what they understand from Islam in their own traditions would say that a Muslim government or Islamic government should be just. And they know what they live in and what they've lived under colonialism and what they live under Kemalism and, in the post-colonial settlement is not fundamentally just governments. And that's where the tension comes into it. They don't have necessarily they've not been able to perhaps systematically express this because there isn't that kind of capacity among the currently among the Muslim parties or abilities to put this in force, but it's something that you feel every day and instinctively.
بروفيسور سلمان، تقول أن مشروع استعادة الخلافة هو مشروع لتفكيك الاستعمار عن الأمة على المستوى المعرفي وكذلك عن المستوى السياسي. وبرأيك فإن نقد الحداثة أو نقد الإمبريالية أو نقد الاستعمار ليس كافيا لابد من البحث عن أرضية أخرى للوقوف عليها. لابد للنقد أن ينتهي إلى محاولة بناء بديل أو الدفاع عن كينونة أخرى بديلة يمكن أن تجعل العالم أفضل أو تجلب العدل للناس. لماذا هذا الخيار؟
Because in the end, like in the book, I make a distinction between clearing and dreaming. And the idea of clearing is this, that if you try and talk, in this case, about the possibility of the Islamicate in the future, but it could be talking about the possibility of anything which is not considered to be Western in the future, you are suddenly confronted with a wall of different kinds of arguments trying to tell you why that would be impossible or why that shouldn't be done. And that kind of epistemological wall, philosophical wall, is part of the defense of the kind of imperial making of the world. So if we want to talk and understand the world as it is going to be in the future, as it's being in the future, then we need to find ways of climbing over that wall and dealing with those kinds of arguments. But if you're always constantly in the question of dealing with the critique, you don't then have the ability to say what is possible, what is the alternative. So in the end, the idea of the critique is only to create the space to dream, to think of an alternative.
All right.
And therefore, if you spend too much time simply in the critique, then you have no hope of actually offering anything different. Because either you are simply saying, well, this is the same, but let's do it better. So to illustrate this point, one of the responses to the critique of Orientalism is to reduce Orientalism to the question of bias and say, well, there are two ways around this. One, you will show that the Orientals, whoever they may be, also are biased, therefore there's nothing to worry about. Or two, all we need to do is make sure that people, Western journalists, commentators, policymakers are more knowledgeable and less biased. And alas, the problem is sorted. Yeah?
So you consolidate what you are fighting.
Yeah, you basically, it's done. It's a minor problem. It's there. It's just a problem of, it could be easily resolved by allowing the critique to be simply a minor critique rather than a fundamental critique. And a fundamental critique is simply a question of having to think about a different paradigm. So one of the things is that, Thomas Kuhn makes a distinction between normal science and revolutionary science, which is a change in paradigm. And the argument is this, that within a paradigm, you will get problems, you will get challenges, but they're resolved. Anomalies, but they can be resolved within the terms of that paradigm. But if you recognize the anomalies are so great that normal science no longer operates,
you have to shift the paradigm.
You have to shift the paradigm. And the shift of the paradigm can't be done through the game of critique and counter-critique, because ultimately you're not using the same, you can't share that same language anymore because you want to move to another ground. So as long as you keep locked into critique and counter-critique in that framework of the normal science that exists, then you are unable to think of what a new paradigm might be.
ولكن ألا يمكن أن يقودنا ذلك إلى فخ من نوع آخر، أعني السعي وراء حلم مستحيل؟
Well, firstly, being human is always being trapped on Earth and with our own finitude, etc. So there is no escape with that. We're all trapped, but we hope for God's mercy to liberate us in the end. But I don't think that's the real problem in a way, because the impossibility of dreams also propels us to the possibility of making things better, to make us imagine the future. I think one of the things that people always have this mind is that any major transformation seems impossible at the moment it's conceived.
All right.
It then is the way you use that to generate, through that kind of articulation of hope, social action that you would be out of the ordinary. And it is through that process that you bring about a transformation, which then you look back and then some academic tells you, well, it was inevitable anyway. So I think, therefore, I would be cautious about saying, well, just because it seems impossible, it may be impossible, but it may not be impossible because it's never been tested. And the question is how you test.
ولكن بروفيسور، أنت في هذه الحالة لا تنادي بفكرة جديدة، أنت تدعو لإحياء مفهوم قديم، ربما تعيد طرحه بصياغة جديدة أو بمخيال سياسي جديد. ولكن هذا المفهوم الذي تعرض إلى مقدار كبير من الضغط الشديد حتى أصبح مفهوما محرما إن شئنا القول. هذه الخلافة اليوم، تعرف التيار الأساسي من الإسلاميين نفسه تخلى عن هذا المصطلح، لم يعد ينادي بها.
How are the mainstream of the Islamists doing right now? Perhaps I'm not saying, who knows, but maybe if they use the term, they might not be doing so badly. I mean, one of the things, and this is a serious point, is the so-called mainstream of the Islamicists have made concession after concession to hegemonic forms of liberalism. And as a result, they have reached a point where they have been unable to sustain any critical energy or any transformational project. And the example was always given until about a year ago. Look how wise our sisters and brothers in Tunisia are compared to our sisters and brothers in Egypt. They're following a non-confrontational, a very low-key approach. And what has been the result? So the point I'm trying to make here is this. If you look at the mainstream Islamism right now, and you look at some of the thinkers which have been conventionally associated with Islamism in the past, Madudi, Sayyid Qutb, Khomeini, Shariati, etc., they have many, many differences. But they also don't start off by having this one-sided dialogue with the kind of liberal hegemony or the depoliticization. Now, here you could say, well, conditions are different, etc. But it does seem to me that the fact that you can't ask an Islamicist what will the alternative look like, what difference would it make if you have an Islamicist dispensation, or even Islamicist too strong, but if you have a dispensation which is more attuned with the Islamicate, how would it be different? On fundamental questions, they find it difficult to articulate even answers because many of them have become so concede to a liberal nationalism, everything. So it makes no difference. And that, I think, is a much more dangerous operation because in the end, there's no alternative left for Muslim publics. There's no possibility of debate. There's no possibility of exchange. There's no possibility of thinking something could be different.
وبالنسبة إليك الليبرالية تنزع السياسة من السياسة.
And the thing is that also remember, liberalism in the Islamicate order is always going to be a subordinate or a peripheral or subjugated liberalism. In a sense that it's liberalism of the weak. It's a liberalism of the periphery. And much of what counts as liberalism is determined in the hegemonic center. So I'll give you two very good examples of this. Three examples of recent years. Take the notion of democracy. Many people would argue that democracy, is about some kind of procedural mechanism for approaching that. Yeah. But you look at the elections in the elections that brought Hamas to
2006,
power, 2006. The elections in Iraq, the elections in Afghanistan. In every single case, when there was a democratic outcome, leaving along the elections in Iran, Algeria in 1924. I mean, there's so many we forget in Iran. Every time there's an election, a democratic election, which doesn't produce the results that's wanted, you have a kind of a disengagement and an attack on that democracy. Now, you should be able to think very easily the possibility of a regime or a government which is both democratic and, let's say, anti-Western. But it is almost impossible to imagine that, because the definitions of democracy coming from the West would always argue that if you're anti-Western, you cannot really be democratic. And this is demonstrated again and again. They will somehow, conjure up, what about the anti-colonial thing? But fundamentally, to be anti-Western and to be democratic does not make logical sense within that kind of hegemonic framework. So I think for all of these things, you asked the question about why critique is not enough, because critique will simply leave us in this kind of working on these small differences. Whereas the issue really is this: how should Muslims live? And the answers to that should be open rather than closed, that Muslims must live in an imitation of a post-Christian order. That, I think, is perhaps not a wise answer.
It's not politically correct, right?
Well, I mean, I'm concerned about the political correct, because it's often used by very right-wing groups to prevent any kind of change in etiquette. It's trying to dismiss the critiques of racism, trying to dismiss that. So it's not a question about, and it also is a mockery, because it's based on the assumption that somehow these people have powerless, when in fact they have been in power for the last 50 years in different permutations. So it's not a question of political, I think it's fundamentally this: what would a Muslim country of the future look like? And could you tell it was Muslim? And in what way would you tell it was Muslim? If it's doing everything the same.
ربما يتخيلون نموذج تركيا أو نموذج ماليزيا، يعني دولة حديثة وديمقراطية وتقوم على بعض القيم الإسلامية العامة.
But even then, you see, I'm not sure they could, because take something like, when we talk something about the AK Party. Take something around the issue of Syrian refugees, right, and the treatment of Syrian refugees. The initial possibility of refusing xenophobia requires Muslimness, which remains critical of the idea of nationalism or xenophobic nationalism, to be anything.
It is.
Right? But wherever you have a concession to liberal nationalism, you have to assume a xenophobic nationalism, which then moves into the project of thinking about Muslimness in national terms. Once you start thinking of Muslimness in national rather than transnational terms, you are now part of that family of Islamophobic impositions which want to basically nationalize Islam and Muslim populations. And the result then, of course, is a fragmentation of the Ummah and any Ummahtic consciousness. And when you do that, the weakness of the Muslims, it weakens the Muslims, it makes it impossible. So why should people in Indonesia care one bit about what's happening in Palestine or East Turkestan or Kashmir? It's too far away, or the Rohingya. So that possibility becomes more difficult. But the fundamentally is that I don't think it's possible for one to be a Muslim in one country, because however people are interpreting, thinking, reflecting on Islam in one part of the Ummah, the ripples have the potential to go in all parts of the Ummah. And therefore that relational entity, which is basically what constitutes the relationship between the nexus between Islam and Muslims and Islam, is mediated through this idea of the Ummahtic. And you can't simply dispense with that without then reducing and actually hollowing out Islam into something very, very different. Because then you could easily say to me, well, Islam in Morocco is a separate religion to Islam in southern China. And if you start saying that consistently enough, it seems to me then there's nothing left.
There is Islams.
There are multiple Islams, but the Islams then become ability for the Islams to locally articulate something beyond themselves closes down. And here is where the loss for humanity comes in, because Islam remains one of the possibilities right now to think and act transnationally, to stop the human being closed within the notion of the nation. And if you take that away, then you are actually moving us towards a planet dominated by xenophobia. And that, I'm not sure, is a good outcome for anyone.
حسن بروفيسور سلمان، إذا وجهت إليك نفس السؤال، ما هي الدولة التي يمكن أن يتخيلها المسلم؟ ما الذي تعنيه بالخلافة؟
I think one of the things that I try to articulate in the book is this, that we need to think about the possibility of a political structure which is not completely bound by the ecology of the existing nation state. Now, in a way, you said, this is an impossible dream. But if you think of, let's say, the European Union, you can see how the European Union, despite all its limitations, has put together a structure in which there is a pooling of sovereignty to produce or try and produce outcomes for all its populations or variations of that. Let's complicate the picture. Why is that possible for the European Union and not possible for the Muslim Ummah? I don't think there's any logical reason. Now, the thing people forget, people often say, well, there's so many differences and there hundreds of years. But this is nonsense. Between 1871 to 1945, Germany and France fought at least 3 major wars. They occupied each other's countries. They killed hundreds of thousands of each other's citizens, if not more. And then, after 1945, a decade later, they form the beginning of the European Union. So if these 2 countries had such deep antagonisms, which led to bloodshed of an industrial scale, are able to put together a confederal or associated arrangement, then even at that level, why would that be impossible? And if you think in geopolitical terms only that, it shouldn't be that difficult to imagine that if there was a political structure which pooled some element of the fragmented Muslim resources, powers, and things like that, whatever, surely that would be better for Muslims everywhere, despite everything. So right now, we have a problem on the planet. The Muslims are too large in number to be completely ignored.
Around 2 billion.
Yeah, right? But they're too weak to be accommodated. So you have a disconnect between the Muslim presence of Muslimness and political mechanisms and structures at a global level that can reflect their interests in any meaningful way. So there's only 2 kind of solutions. One is that you try and weaken Muslimness and go back to a state where Muslims are no longer conscious of being 2 billion and they start thinking of themselves in these narrow nationalist terms, which is a kind of a balkanization at a global scale even further. It's more difficult to do because the Muslimness is not being projected by state authorities. It's actually been done by a popular level. So how you do that, how you break people's idea of being ummatic requires a different types of violence in a way. Or you find a structure to bring some kind of close that gap between these discordant positions. Or you carry on with a series of a global dirty war in which Muslim attempts to be autonomous, to have agency, to try and regulate and control their lives is constantly being crushed. Now, right now, you have a number of struggles going on where, you can see what's, for example, in Pakistan, or you can see in Tunisia, you can see in Algeria, you can see many places where even the demand for Muslims to have some kind of autonomy over their daily lives is met by a resistance. And never mind the cases like, the familiar ones, which is happening in Palestine or in Kashmir or Eastern Turkestan or among the Rohingya. You can multiply those examples. So ultimately, it seems to me that really what we're talking about as a caliphate is a metaphor for the name that gives Muslim voices some capacity in the shape of the world and the shape of their own destiny.
ولكن ربما يقول أصحاب النظرية النقدية أو ما بعد الاستعمارية بأن فكرة الخلافة فكرة جيدة للمسلمين، ولكن النقد الإنسانوي الذي يدافع عن قيم مشتركة للجميع، هذا النقد لا يستثني أحدا ولا يخص دينا دون آخر.
But I would argue that the argument for the caliphate for Muslims and therefore having no consequence for everyone else is deeply flawed.
Yes.
For first reason is this, that if you think about the caliphate, it will not be for Muslims because it's based on a particular kind of principles. And here the question is that, Muslims and non-Muslims are also enabled through that process anyway. So this one thing is that. So there's and this is one of the logics back of the nation state. The difference between an Islamic state and a state which allows for Muslimness to be expressed is actually fundamental. You can have they're both in a sense inclined. What people often assume is that you have a state of Muslims, but a state where Muslimness can be expressed doesn't have to be a state of Muslim. In fact, for the first 300 years, the Islamic political order was one of minority. Muslims are a minority, right? And many places they remained a minority. But so it's not the idea that you need. You just need the idea of a constitutional order or some order where you say these are Islamic principles and therefore it's there. But also, in other words, in terms of the question of Muslimness, so neither parts of Asia nor parts of Africa, we could debate the New World, but let's leave there for a moment, are outside the project of Muslimness. And I think currently, and this may change, one way of expressing that hope for something different and something transnational has to go through the route of Muslimness. Now, when people say, well, I believe in humanist ideals, the problem is this, that belief in humanist ideals has no vector. No one is carrying that.
Yeah.
We saw that in Ukraine when the people were saying, we were told that Ukraine is about universal human rights. And with our own eyes, we saw people who were defined as being African or Asian being taken off buses, being given differential treatment as they were going through, trying to escape Ukraine, etc. And we were still told this is about universal human rights. And we won't get into the difference in treatment of refugees from the Ukraine, from refugees from other parts of the world. So the idea of Europe or the West incarnating universalism has been so ripped to shreds that it requires great acts of amnesia for anyone, even in the West, to believe it anymore. After Guantanamo, after the torture, after all of these things, it's very, very difficult, after the history of colonialism and racial violence, to pretend that these universal values have been carried in any non-exclusionary way. Western articulations of universalism have been undermined by the practice of racial colonial logics inherent to that universalizing project. And therefore their claims for universalism cannot be separated from the realities of the racial colonial orders that they've produced. And if you are going to talk about a new humanism, you need to be able to think about new political constituencies which don't need to go through that circuit of the colonial and the racial. And right now, it seems to me that it's impossible to do without including the Islamic hate.
صحيح، ونحن نرى نتائج ذلك أمامنا. يعني اليوم ربما مرت أكثر من 50 عام على نشر إدوارد سعيد لكتابه الاستشراق في 1978، ويبدو أن الخطاب المعادي للإسلام في الغرب يزداد قوة ويزداد شراسة حتى بين رؤساء دول لا يفترض أن يكونوا جاهلين بهذا الإسلام. كيف تقرأ الإسلاموفوبيا؟ كيف تقرأ ما الذي يمثله الإسلام بالنسبة لأوروبا؟
I think one of the things in all my work I've been very, very keen to avoid is the focus that often comes up, especially in the US context, where Islamophobia is reduced to the effects or a consequence of 9/11. Now, the fact is that the current arguments of Islamophobia, it was a report published in Britain in 1997. So this is 4 years before the War on Terror.
And 1 year after Huntington.
Yeah, 1 year after Huntington. And also in kind of a response to two major events which were unfolding. The Rushdie affair in Britain and the headscarf affair in France, where for the first time you saw different articulations of the state, in the case of France, taking on a very antagonistic relationship to parts of a citizenship who were expressing their Muslimness. In a similar way, in the whole sort of situation around the Rushdie affair, right? So, in a way, what is it that begins in 1997? Part of it is the unification of the right-wing parties as the European project takes hold. So to some extent, the right wing was often organized nationally. I mean, they had, international links and things like that. But with the creation of the consolidation of a European Union, you suddenly have the translation of the various minorities as being Muslim. So instead of saying that there are 3 million Kurds in Germany or 5 million Moroccans and Senegalese and in France, or 2 million South Asians, you say that Europe has 20 million Muslim minorities there. And suddenly, so to construct the identity of Europe, what is non-Europe? What is outside Europe? And this is why the debate about the Christian, whether Bosnia or even Turkey, which is an interesting case. Turkey first applied to join the European Union when countries which have been admitted to the European Union didn't even exist, right? So I think a lot of it's locked into initially to European identity. I think that has been a large part of it. It's also been affected by the kind of success of the anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles, but which has allowed a kind of post-colonial racism to emerge, in which you have Islamophobia as a type of racism that can still be indulged and supported. So I think there are a number of these factors ultimately going to the crisis, I would argue, of Western identity as it begins to be clear that it's no longer central in the world. And it's that kind of recognition, because they have never really confronted the loss of a world centered around them. And therefore, that is driving much of Islamophobia, how to cope with a world in which Europe is no longer central. And Europe, I mean North America and all of these other things. Is no longer central.
And that's the deep context.
Yeah. And I think if you look at most of the iterations of Islamophobia, they often focus on these moments of the idea that the Muslim invader is basically trying to eradicate European civilization.
Yes. وهل تقرأ صعود الحركات اليمينية والشعبوية باعتبار أنها صادرة من نفس السياق هذا?
If you look at someone like Andrej Breivik, I mean, it's a very interesting, he himself is not interesting, but look at the worldview that he has. He is Islamophobic. He dresses like a crusader. He is pro-Zionist and anti-Semitic. Now, the right in Europe was deeply anti-Semitic. And now you have a situation that anti-Semitism to some extent has been replaced by Islamophobia and a kind of pro-Zionist position, that Israel is a bastion of Western civilization in Asia, etc. So there is, if you look at every single instance of the alt-right, or variations of this neo-national right, all of them are unified around the figure of the Muslim as the demonic presence that needs to be eradicated to allow these societies to prosper, to be themselves. And this rages across all kinds of fields around their critique of feminism, their critique of immigration, economy, all of these things it's the figure of the Muslim. Whether you are in Poland or Portland, somewhere along the line, there is a Muslimness which is driving that narrative which threatens Western civilization as we know it. Or, as many of these neocons will talk about, how Europe is dying, it's being replaced. It's, after the march in Charlottesville, where, the idea that Muslims and Jews will not replace us, kind of that we are being replaced by these populations. So all of these things come together. Countries like in Czech, where there's only, I think, about 10,000 Muslims, but the idea that, there's going to be a demographic explosion and Czechia will be dominated by a Muslim population in 10, 15 years or something. I mean, these are kind of, these narratives which are driving some of that, but all of them are based on the idea and the incompatibility of the Muslimness and Europeanness. And for Europeanness to survive, it must mean the eradication or subjugation or regulation of Muslimness. And that then has become leaked into a wider narrative of what it means to be modern. And if it means to be modern, to be Western, then one of the ways you express your Westernness is by being anti-Muslim.
عادة الناس تسأل عن تأثير هذه الخطابات على المسلمين في الغرب، ولكن دعني أذهب بالسؤال إلى مكان آخر. ما هو تأثير هذه الخطابات على المسلمين في العالم الإسلامي؟ يعني يبدو لنا اليوم أن هناك عودة للهويات السياسية الصلبة الكبيرة، بل وهناك عودة للبعد الحضاري الذي كان مخفيا لوقت طويل في السياسة. يعني بعد ما حصل في سياسات الحرب على الإرهاب، بعد ما حصل في العراق وأفغانستان، بل وأخيرا المشاهد التي رأيناها في كأس العالم الأخير، جميعها جعلت ربما الشعوب تنظر إلى هذه الدوافع العميقة التي تعتقد أنها كانت دائما متخفية وراء لغة دبلوماسية وأنيقة. وهذا يذكرني بمثال كنت تطرحه دائما، وهو شديد التعبير عن ربما عجز النقد عن إحداث فارق. هذه قصة الإمبراطور العاري، يخرج إلى الناس ولكن لا أحد يجرؤ أن يعترف بالحقيقة، ثم يقف الطفل ويقول انظروا الإمبراطور عاري. بحسب القصة الإمبراطور خسر شعبيته، خسر سطوته، خسر الهالة التي كانت تحفه وانفض الناس عنه. لكن في الواقع ليس هذا ما يحدث. المثقف النقدي يعتقد أنه هو الذي يصرخ في الحقيقة ويجابه السلطة بها، لكن على أرض الواقع ما هي نتيجة ذلك؟
And I think in the real story, everyone just carries on. So even though the critical voice, people just pretend that nothing's happened. And there's no moment. You see, we still look for that moment of revelation, that moment that you disclose the truth and people will be so horrified that they will change.
Truth against authority.
The idea, the liberal, you speak truth to power.
Yeah.
But the real thing is that truth and power are not opposite relationships. Only power can speak to power. And that's...
Wow.
So it seems to me that is one of the biggest problems that we kind of have, that the idea that the moment of truth will reveal something on its own. And I don't think on its own it does anything or doesn't do much. Let's put it this way, because it has to then circulate. It has to be transformational. That moment of just saying, oh, this is horrible, cannot be this moment that, you say, this is, you have to do something. It's really, really difficult to see that moment, except maybe exceptionally at this moment of, that moment. But it doesn't necessarily transform into major. I mean, if you think about it, people talk about storming the Bastille. There was nobody in there. The actual story of the storming the Bastille is not the Bastille being stormed. It's the revolution that comes afterwards and symbolically says we begin with the storming of the Bastille. So it's a reconstruction. Without the revolution, there's no storming of the Bastille. So I do think there is that kind of belief that all we have to do, and this lies under a lot of interfaith dialogue, is that, if people get to know the true Islam, they will be transformed. But I'm not sure that's where the level you're working at, because it's not really about knowing the true Islam or not. This is really not about Muslims. It's about a construction. We're basically starring in someone else's psychodrama in a sense there. It's about Europe having to cope with a world that exceeds its horizons now. And that's a major, major challenge. And I don't think there's much career for us to be, I've said this before, that, to be therapists for Europeans, or, allow them to vent their crisis on the bodies of Muslim women and men.
طب دعني هنا بروفيسور سلمان أطرح سؤالا ربما يفكر فيه الكثيرون. الكثير من هذا الكلام يبدو جريئا، يعني لو قاله أسامة مثلا في بلد عربي فإنه على الأرجح لن يقابلك مرة أخرى. لكن أنت تقول ما تقول وأنت في جامعة ليدز في بريطانيا. ما هو دور المثقف؟ ما هي دور الأكاديمية في هذه العملية النقدية؟
But I'm not saying anything that is significant. And that's the difference. I mean, I know many Muslim writers, for example, they would, go to Malaysia and they come back saying, or they go to Lebanon, or they go to Turkey, or wherever they go. It doesn't matter. The country doesn't matter. And they come back disappointed that it was impossible for them to freely express themselves, whereas in the West you can express yourself. And some of them go so far to say that, the real Muslim countries now lie in the European Union. But this is only based on the idea that you don't understand the deeply rootedness of racism and colonialism, etc. But more importantly, the reason why governments in Muslimstan are concerned about the expression of Islam, because it means something. Up till the war on terror, the ability to say things about Islam had no significance, or very little significance, because there was no Muslim political constituency that was shaped by that. So you could have, it's like why would a minister or a bureaucrat be worried about what people are saying about astrology in Paris or Madrid? It doesn't matter. It's just, You could have a dispute about astrology. What do you do to astrology now that Pluto is no longer a planet? I mean,
But it's much more serious than that.
It's become serious, but I'm trying to say it was not. Remember, there was a period that the idea was that Islam would follow the way of Christianity and other religions, and would be
another version of
and it would
Protestantism.
basically Protestantism, and it would just become something that you celebrate on the high holidays and at weddings and funerals and things like that. This was the expectation, and right now the research on political Islam and Islamism has been going on for 50 years. But you'll notice that every couple of years is punctuated by the end of political obituary, the end of political Islam, the end of Islamism, every single moment.
You don't think there is an end for Islamism?
Look, ultimately, the only thing that is an end is God, but so there's for everything ends otherwise. But I think it's a misunderstanding of what is the scale. It's a misunderstanding of what's involved. So put it this way, communism has ended before Islamism, in a sense, in timely kind of way. And the reason is because it was a misunderstanding of what Islamism was. Islamism is driven by and strengthened by the consciousness of over 1 billion Muslims becoming more and more conscious of their Muslimness and wanting to express that in all parts of their life. It has a constituency. It's a very large constituency. What it doesn't have is, of course, representative institutions to articulate that into practical projects and things like that. But to dismiss it was considered to be simply one of these, occasionally you get these kind of crazes that go on for a few months and then everyone forgets about it and things like that. This was how it was dismissed. It'll happen, or the idea that, this has been funded by petrodollars, or the idea that this is basically to do with urban-rural migration. I mean, there were all of these ideas, or whatever. But the point is that what is never taken seriously as a philosophical or ideological project which reflects a constituency, a global constituency. And that is repeated again and again. When the early days of the War on Terror, there was this, there was a bombing 7/7 in Britain.
Yeah.
And the people who carried it out were mainly from a Kashmiri background. And when that happened, many commentators and journalists rushed to Kashmir to find out the secret of why it happened there. 2 weeks later, there was an attempted similar bombing, mainly going to be carried out, or people involved in it, from the Horn of Africa. So suddenly the argument was, well, what is it about Kashmir and the Horn of Africa which is common? Poverty. So there's a whole thing about, well, you need to do something about poverty. A week later, there is an attempt in Australia and Glasgow by doctors carrying out similar kind of attacks. So what do doctors and these people from the Horn of Africa, Kashmiris, have? They're men. And then, of course, you have female suicide bombers, right? And now, so what is it now between what do men, poor, rich, educated women, or the groupings are growing, multiply? Because fundamentally, there was no attempt to understand what this is a political dynamic, rather than a kind of empirical dynamic that can be located to some kind of specific cultural element.
Yeah.
It was a denial of the significance, the philosophical or the political significance of an Islamist position or Muslimness.
ولكن المدافعين عن الإسلام يلجؤون دائما إلى مقاربات نسميها سياقية لتفسير الدوافع الفاعلين المسلمين، بمعنى البحث عن السياق الاجتماعي أو الاقتصادي أو السياسي لظاهرة من الظواهر. وهذا مفيد جدا في الدفاع، كيف نفهم دور البطش السياسي أو الفقر أو الحالة النفسية للفاعل. ولكننا في النهاية لا نجد أي تعريف إيجابي للإسلام، إنه يتحول إلى شيء دائما جزء من السياق، ليس له محتوى في ذاته.
No, I think there's two things here. It depends. Most of these conversations, and I have these conversations all the time, is to contextualize this because you are responding to a debate. So someone would say to me, if Muslims were, what we need to do, for example, is promote Sufi Islam, right?
Yeah.
And Sufi Islam is not violent.
Yeah.
And then you say, do you know who the Chechens are? The idea of violence being inscribed in certain variants of Islam rather than inscribed through a process in which Muslims feel that they have no other political recourse is a very different thing. It's a depoliticization of the Muslim element. So I think when you're having these points, they're made in context of the conversation you're being asked for. It's not a question that there's no such thing as Islam.
Of course.
But there is a question that whether it's Islam is, there's also this thing about Islam as a religion of peace. And I don't think it's a religion of peace or a religion of war. I mean, I don't think, there's a question about religion which we won't get into. But Islam is able to be mobilized for purposes where Muslims feel it helps them to make better sense of the world around them. Even at a very personal level. And I don't use this as a very lean on it heavily. When you read the Quran, you'll find at different times in your life, certain surah speak to you more than others. It's not that you've forgotten the others, but you find solace in one rather than the other at a certain moment in time.
Indeed.
And that is to do with your own, where you are, or a certain kind of moment, something you see, etc. And that changes. So the idea that Islam is one thing and one thing only is the ultimate Orientalist creation. And for Muslims, Islam cannot be just this one thing, because Islam transcends any kind of ontic manifestation of that. It is not reducible to simply these kind of very narrowest formulations. There is a story that runs around that one of the, and this may or may not be true, but the logic is interesting of the story, that when the war in Chechnya was going on, there was a formulation by the Russians that they would burn any Muslim Chechen. And because they would burn them, they would not be able to, they would realize they can't go to, they want to be properly buried, therefore they would not ascend to heaven, and and this would demotivate them. Now, the absurdity of this position, leaving aside, if you're a Muslim, and you believe in God, Allah, do you think it is beyond the ability of Allah to say, well, I'm sorry, this body has not been properly buried, I will not. If you think you are fighting for God, then surely this is not a deterrent. But why would you think this is a deterrent? Because you think that Muslims do not think. They don't have a capacity to reflect. You know, it's that kind of Orientalism. So one of the key markers of Orientalism is Islam is something which is fixed as one thing. When I think Islam has a much more dynamic but very intimate relationship with the Ummah. And there is a kind of a relationship between the ulama and the Ummah around the construction of Islam all the time.
And that's what makes Islam, at the same time, it's not everything.
No. It's not everything, but it's not nothing either.
Yeah.
You know, if you and I go to Timbuktu and then we go to Jakarta and we want to say Jummah prayers, we don't expect there will be differences, but at the same time, we know how to conduct ourselves. We have some idea. We have some expectations. They may be thwarted, but they exist. But it's not a singular element that you will say, you know. And I think this is the point, that Islam is, it is this kind of relation that kind of runs through the Ummah. And therefore, it is held and bound by that. Because you can't then say, I will define Islam in this way, unless you are able to not necessarily build a consensus, but also to get recognition by the Ummah in its abstract collectivity that this is what it is. And in the absence of that, you know, you are crazy, which is fine, but, you know, you can't just simply say, I will say it's this, or I mean, let's be honest, how many fatwas do we know get issued left, right, and center? And the authority and the respect that communities give to the fatwa depends on not just the authority of the fatwa person who's issued the fatwa, but also whether it makes links with the community's understanding, the Ummah's understanding of what Islam should be at that moment in time. That's what gives it agency. Otherwise, it's not a, you know, it's not a bit of AI code where you just put the program in and the Muslim. It doesn't work like that. And this is when the Orientalists conceit that Muslims are simply like that Islam is simply this kind of notion that this is why, you know, the Rand Corporation and others thought about, we need to change the Quran, and we will print out versions of the Quran which will take out the violent passages. Who would ever take that Quran seriously? Not because they have any love of violence or anything like that, but simply they would know that this is a Quran manufactured in a long history of colonial manufacturings of Islam, and it wouldn't have no, you know, it would capture nothing. And I think that's the confidence that we have. I mean, and it's that missing confidence to say, actually, no.
So we don't have institutions to defend what Islam is, but we have Ummah. In that sense.
I think right now, we always have inshallah, we will always have the Ummah. But right now, that is the strongest and the complex which is most immune to external intervention because of its transnationality, and its globality, and its scale, and therefore a political structure that recognizes both those elements would actually be something that which will underwrite the plurality of the planet, which will be good for everyone, including Muslims.
بروفيسور سلمان، قررت أن تضع أعمالك ضمن ما تسميه بالنظرية النقدية المسلمة، وليس مثلا نقد ما بعد الاستعماري أو نقد الإمبريالية أو نقد الحداثة أو غير ذلك. هذا المصطلح أو هذا الحقل، ما هي الإضافة التي تميزه عن غيره عن العقول؟ وما الذي يتميز به وكيف تعرفه؟
I think critical Muslim studies began with two insights. One sort of began about 2011. I was in when I was working in Australia, and there was a research center set up, and wanted to think through some of these issues. And then there was a summer school in Granada around that, and then 2015 we launched the journal Reorient, the Journal of Critical Muslim Studies. And what unified these various ideas was to think about the relationship between decoloniality and decolonial thinking and the Islamicate. And partly it was a response to see that, decolonial thought had many, many rich tools and understandings and ways of thinking around the present, which would be very helpful to continue and deepen the project of decolonization. So already in Fundamental Fear, the book is already talking about a deepening of decolonization. So in a way, it looked like the decolonial thought would be part of that kind of deep. Now, the thing is that decolonial thought had a particular kind of relationship with the experience, mainly around the Atlantic, what is now Latin America, enslaved Africaneity, as the kind of, and the whole notion of the indigenous Africaneity, and these kinds of, and the link there was provided by the 1492, which is both the date of the conquest of Granada and the conquest of the Americas. I mean, they're linked in a sense there, okay? So that was the end of it. The challenge is this, that so the idea is this, that in 1492, you have the transformation of the world in which European hegemony becomes global, or begins the process of becoming global. And this is, again, very interesting and very kind of powerful idea. And it's also linked with the idea that colonialism, which, European colonialism, is globally transformational. It transforms the whole planet. But the problem here is this, that linked with the idea of European hegemony beginning in 1492 was also the idea that the subjugation of non-Europeans, them becoming, marginalized, subaltern in a way, and therefore you can compare them. The problem is that 1492 is only 40 years after 1453. When Muslim, and one of the
of Constantinople.
Yeah, right? And which is far, significant. So when Granada falls, one of the things that happens, of course, is that it introduces a new form of governance experimented in Iberia, which leads to kind of the racial state in a way, where previously, by and large, governments used to say, pay your taxes and don't be too rude about the rulers, and we leave you alone. Basically, that was the role of government, right? What happens subsequently is that you are now having to regulate populations. So you need to make sure that those Muslims and Jewish populations are really not a threat to the state. And again, so you start thinking about expulsions. You also then start thinking about conversions. But then how do you make sure that they are really converted? So things like, for example, you send people around to check how many times people are bathing. Muslims bathe too much. You look at, for example, are they hiding the Quran in their houses? And we have evidence that many of the Qurans were hidden in these things. So you now have to survey the population, which of course you can see how it turns into the modern state in terms of surveillance, etc. But the context to all of this is not the subjugation of the Muslims or Muslimness. It's the fear that a Muslim army will come from what is Africa and reclaim Granada and liberate Muslims and Jews who've been have been subjugated. So it's a very different power dynamic. So once you start talking about the decolonial and relation to the Islamicate, you have to confront the fact that much of decolonial thinking has a very Eurocentric narrative about the emergence of Europe and European modernity.
All right.
And that then is why you need critical Muslim studies, because it's more than just an application of decolonial thought to the Muslim subject. Because as you know, and some of the thinkers associated with decolonial thinking also concede that you can't have a decolonial thinking where the Muslim or anyone else just simply becomes the wretched of the earth. The Muslims have a very different relationship. Now, that leads to, if you deny that relationship, and you do this by saying, well, all the non-European political structures were simply colonial structures like the European structures, which is not the case. That is problematic. But you start arguing that, and that then has how do you narrate the history of Islam? Where would Muslims be? How many Muslims would be without the 100-year expansion? Many of the Muslims who are criticizing the 100-year jihad, in a sense, how many of them would still be Muslim if it wasn't for that? So there's a condition of possibility in this. Yeah. But also, what does that mean? How is that colonial rule? Not all imperial formations are based on racial colonial ordering. So that's one aspect of these are the problems. So critical Muslim studies really is not centered on the Muslim subject or studies of Muslim. It's centered in the relationship between Muslimness and non-Muslimness in particular fields. It's a knowledge of Muslimness. Now, what's happened is that the label critical Muslim studies has proved very popular in all kinds of places. And in North America, it's often taken on the shape that rather than looking at critical Muslim studies in relation to Muslimness, there's simply an idea that the critical Muslim studies is really a reapplication of the critical race theory, where instead of race, you talk about Muslim. It's about the racialization of Muslims only, which of course leaves out the whole fact that right up till the end of the 19th century, the idea of Muslimness in the world was not as a subaltern, subjugated formation exclusively. You know, in many places, there was actually a struggle going on wherever Europeans went in what we call Africa and Asia. Often they found Muslims were there already. And often Muslims were leading those societies. Many of those societies, for example, on the coast of Africa, resisting European enslavement raids, were Muslims. So there's a very mixed kind of picture. And I think one of the things about critical Muslim studies then is to try and take seriously the critique of Orientalism and say, okay, what does that really look like once you take that seriously? To take the colonial insights seriously and see how that feels out, but also to understand that European epistemology of the time was linked to a particular way of thinking about the relationship between what we now call social sciences and humanities and natural sciences. So there's a kind of a positivism, and it's a kind of stepping back that you can't just go around having this kind of positivist understanding, because many of the terms that you need for positivism to work don't necessarily have the same emphasis in different kinds of relationships. So, for example, the category of religion. You can't just go around counting what religions are without being aware of the history of the formation of the category of religion and how that changes the way people think, rather than saying now there are 14 world religions. Well, no, the world was divided into 14 world religions. And it's interesting to see how
this category has been.
Yeah. So I think critical Muslim studies is really about reflecting on the knowledge basis around which the project between modernity and coloniality, which are really two aspects of the same coin, reshape the world in a way in which Muslimness then becomes problematic, along with many other forms of non-Europeanness. And that, I think, is what the heart of the Critical Muslim Studies project is.
كتابك الأول خوف عميق أو Fundamental Fear ختمته باقتباس من فرانس فانون، كان يقول: لقد انتهت اللعبة الأوروبية أخيرا وعلينا البحث عن شيء جديد. ولاحظت أن الخواتيم مرعية، فختمت كتابك الثاني استعادة الخلافة باقتباس هذه المرة من ابن رشد في قفلة ربما يعني إسلامية الطابع في دعائه ولواه بالعقل والحكمة حمدا كثيرا دائما. الآن توشك أن تنشر كتابك الثالث Islamism as Philosophy، الإسلامية كفلسفة. كيف ستختم هذا الكتاب؟
So far, the first word of that book, I mean, not the first sentence of the book proper begins with Bismillah. And the idea is that the last sentence of the book will end with Inshallah.
Allah.
That's,
Allah.
I don't know what's going to be in between, but that's what I do.
I hope you are going to see it.
Inshallah.
Very soon.
Inshallah.
And another books.
Thank you.
البروفيسور سلمان سيد، شكرا جزيلا على هذه المقابلة. استمتعت بهذا الحوار الثري والغني. شكرا جزيلا لك.
Well,
Thank you very much. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.